Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome in new episode of the Atlantic Dialogue Web TV. Pleasure to have today the professor and former ambassador, Mr. Mohamed Lulishki. Professor Lulishki, good morning.
Good morning.
Professor Lulishki, I remind you are a senior fellow at the Policy Center for New South. You are also a professor affiliate in University Mohammed VI Polytechnic and also former ambassador of Morocco in Croatia, in Bosnia and in the United Nations. So the subject of the conversation of today concern especially the crisis of multilateralism. As you know, Professor Lulishki, the multilateralism constitutes the basis of international cooperation. However, and since the economic crisis of 2008, the global integration of trade, of market, of finance has slowed down, with some suggesting that we are today in a period of slow globalization or even deglobalization. And in the same time, the migration crisis of 2015, the democratic crisis of 2016, the climate crisis, the trade war between United States and China, the health crisis and the effect of COVID-19 pandemic on global value chain, and recently the Ukraine war have accelerated the crisis of multilateralism, but at the level of norm and that of institution. So, as a first question, Professor Lulishki, and before to explore the question of the crisis of multilateralism, what do you think about the evolution of the multilateralism since the establishment of United Nations? What do you think? What is the meaning of multilateralism? What is the objective of multilateralism? What do you think about the evolution of multilateralism?
Thank you for the invitation. Multilateralism is about cooperation between states, regardless of their power, of their level of development. Multilateralism is about striking a balance between power and solidarity. Multilateralism is about norms, basic norms that everybody has to abide by, and institutions that are mandated to promote cooperation between states. Multilateralism allows those who do not have a voice in global governance to have a voice, a collective voice, in order to preserve and to defend their interests. Multilateralism does not go back only to the United Nations. United Nations is a cornerstone of multilateralism. It gave a boost to multilateralism. But multilateralism as a mechanism to crystallize and to promote interdependence and cooperation between states goes back at least to the 19th century, where you have, for example, the telecommunication union, when you have the postal union, universal union, that goes back, I think, to 1856 and 1879. So multilateralism at the technical level was the first step to promote this interdependence between states. It was easy because it was purely administrative coordination and technical coordinations. Politics was outside of the scope. When the First World War came with the devastating consequences, everybody thought about the idea of, if we want to promote trade, interdependence, we have also to achieve peace. And the idea came to establish the League of Nations in 1919 through the Treaty of Versailles. We know the history. It didn't work because the United States Senate did not ratify the convention, and many states were out of the scope of this organization. Came the Second World War, and even before the end, it began in 1942. The three main powers, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States decided to promote another project of multilateralism, something that will be universal, something that will avoid a third world war, and something that will draw the logical conclusions and the lessons learned from the failure of the League of Nations.
Yes.
And here came the United Nations in 1945 with all the very idealistic objectives that you will find in the Charter of the United Nations, with all the promises that were given in the Charter and in the first beginning of this Charter. What happened is in 1945 you have only 51 countries, mainly Western-dominated organizations. The process of decolonization changed drastically the situations. Here you have new, freshly independent states coming from Africa and Asia that came to the international arena, and they had to adhere to something that is called the United Nations. The first step that any nation that gained its independence was to put its candidature for the admission to the United Nations, because it gave you a status, it gives you an international multilateral recognition, and it's like a birth certificate on the international level. So the time will not allow to go through all the evolution, but the United Nations expanded in terms of membership. The United Nations expanded in terms of topic on its agenda. Now we are close to 150 topics on the agenda of the United Nations. The challenges that the United Nations has to face are not only numerous, but they are also extremely complex. So the system, the multilateral system, which is extremely rich, extremely expanded in terms of number of organizations, has more and more difficulties to cope with these new challenges. And here comes lots of questioning about the legitimacy, about the efficiency of international organizations, about the representativity of these organizations, and about the finding a balance between sovereignty, democracy, and power within all the international organizations.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Louishki. Of course, you have exposed the evolution of the multilateralism, the importance of the multilateralism, the question of balance between sovereignty, democracy, the impact of the decolonization process in the evolution of multilateralism. However, today the multilateralism seems in crisis. According to your opinion, Professor, as an expert, what are the main causes of the crisis of multilateralism today?
Today, more and more scholars, academia, researchers, politicians are talking about the crisis of multilateralism, the erosion of multilateralism, the agony of multilateralism, the clinical death of multilateralism. So it comes to questioning multilateralism as a mean to promote peace, security, and cooperation, which is meant by the establishment of the international organizations. What are the causes? Well, I think the causes are within, even in the Charter of the United Nations itself and in the charters of different organizations. Look, for example, to the balance of power within the United Nations. You have a Security Council that have the primary responsibility in peace and security. You have the General Assembly, which is the democratic arena where all the states, small and powerful, have a say-in on each and every challenge and every topics. But when it comes to taking the decisions, you have only 15 members. I would say even 5 permanent members who will take the decision on behalf not
By
only
members
of the
Security
15
Council
members,
resolution, yes.
but in the name of all the international community.
Mhm.
So 5 states, powerful states, are taking the basic, the most important decision on behalf of 188 countries. Secondly, the veto power, I'm not going to indulge into the meaning or into the impact or the questions of the veto power or the abuse or misabuse of the veto power, but all the decision-making process is meant to accommodate, if not to have the agreement of the 5 powerful countries. Some even say that international organizations are something like a place where people will come express their views with no impact on the reality. 2, second idea, international organizations are merely a tool in the hands of the most powerful, the ones that will decide about war and will decide about peace. When the powerful countries want to use the United Nations for something like legitimacy, they will use it. For example, the first war against Iraq to oust the Iraqis from Kuwait was something that for which the United States went through the Security Council in order to have the legitimacy. When the United States decided the second war against Iraq, it was not by an authorization of the Security Council, but it was a coalition of the willing, which is outside. So whenever it's convenient for the powerful countries to use the United Nations or international organization in general, they will use it. But when it doesn't meet their interests or their concerns, they decide unilaterally to act outside of this organization. The second impediment of the functioning of the United Nations or international organization is the fact that you have a competition, you have a rivalry between the most powerful countries. They are there to give priorities that meet their interests, but at the same time, the organizations or multilateralism can only function where you have a convergence of views and intentions of the most powerful countries. When you have a competition, the other states are hesitant to take this side or the other side. And finally, you find the international organizations completely paralyzed, not able to act. Just the case of the war in Ukraine, you have a permanent member, okay, that have decided a military operation that have been, I think, perceived by all countries as at least violating the territorial integrity and the unity of a given state. And despite all the efforts by all the states in the United Nations, nothing came out from the United Nations. Secretary General was extremely, has his hand tied, not able to do anything, because you have 2 permanent members of the Security Council that will neutralize each other because they have the veto power. Because you cannot do anything without the consent of these very powerful countries. There is a crisis of multilateralism because multilateralism did not deliver what the countries of the Global South expected. What these countries expected, in addition to peace and security is development.
Yes. So, Professor, I understand, according to your opinion, of course, that the United Nations system need revision, in particular about the power of General Assembly and the Security Council. However, about my third question, of course, according to your opinion, with the actual crisis of multilateralism, do you think, or does multilateralism need a new approach of international cooperation, particularly about when we take in consideration the relation between North and South, and also the importance of the North-South cooperation approach?
The main criticism against multilateralism is, first, it's not delivering in terms of peace and security. Look what for example, if we just see Africa and all the major and protracted conflicts that are still going on in Mali, in Central African Republic, in Democratic Republic of Congo, the presence of the United Nations did not prevent the continuation and even the exacerbation of this conflict. Secondly, as I mentioned, in terms of delivering on economic and social development, you remember that in the 80s and late 70s, the international organization decided that states, wealthy states, will devote 1% of their GDP to aid and development. Okay. This percentage has been decreased to 0.7%. But when you go to the list of countries who respect this threshold of 0.7% of GDP, you might find less than 10 countries who are provided. Look to what happened, for example, in Sharm el-Sheikh summit. The whole summit was not about creating new obligations, about consolidating the current obligation, but it was only asking all member states for one thing: implementations. Mm-hmm. You remember that the Paris Agreement is not a binding agreement. It is based on voluntary commitment from the states that will take some obligations that will only report, but there is absolutely no accountability for these states. So it's up to their will, it's up to their good intention, it's up to their good faith to deliver or not to deliver. The $100 billion that was promised for the developing countries in order to help them mitigate this transition to green economy, to new and renewable resources, was not delivered, and promises are followed by other promises. When you see the consequences, not only of COVID-19, but also of this war, all the reports of the WFP, of the UNHCR say that poverty is going to exacerbate in developing countries. And humanitarian assistance is needed. But who is providing this humanitarian assistance? It's the developed countries. In these developed countries today, the concerns is about satisfying each and every own population and own citizens. Sovereignty is gaining more and more momentum, and interdependence is more and more put at the end of the priority of developed countries.
Yes. So, Professor, you mentioned that the global governance system needs a new approach of cooperation. According to your opinion, what the Global South can do?
Oh, so many things that the Global South can do. First of all, I think at least three things. First, I think the Global South has to endeavor to present itself with a united front in multilateral negotiations. It's not easy. There are a lot of difference between, not only between Africans and Latin American and Asian countries of the non-aligned movement or the G77, but even within the African countries you have huge differences and huge interests. Secondly, people will listen to you only when you have something to offer. And if we want to have something to offer and to exist on the international arena, I think developing countries, global south countries, mainly African countries, have to achieve first their integration at the sub-regional level, at the regional level, and at continental level. Lots of good things are happening, for example, in Asia and in Latin America. Africa, unfortunately, is lagging behind. We have so many plans, we have so many roadmaps, we have so many programs, but it lacks two things. It lacks consistency of the follow-up, and it lacks funding. When you have the whole continent that has to rely 75% on external financial contributions to deal with your own African conflicts, addressing peace and security in Africa, you cannot impose your agenda. It's those who are funding you that will impose their priorities, impose their agendas. So first of all, I think first we have to achieve our autonomy as African countries. And I hope that the implementation of the African free trade zone will be something that all the 55 countries will adhere to and will implement faithfully and forcefully. I hope also that we will also, as African countries, consolidate our position and our bargaining power by presenting ourselves as countries, as societies and nations that put the rule of law as one of its priority, respect of human rights, institutions that can deliver to the needs and to the expectations of citizens. How are we going to do that? In which environment? You know that today's environment is extremely volatile. Multilateralism has not only to reform itself, but has to come back to its basic foundational principles, which are indivisibility, inclusivity, solidarity, and reciprocity.
Yes. So, as a final question, Professor Lurischki, with the actual war in Ukraine, how the actual crisis of multilateralism could develop and evolve during the next years?
How multilateralism will evolve? I think if we can consider, if we want to consider the different approaches that are offered to us in terms of revitalizing multilateralism, giving an impulse to multilateralism, you have three approaches. You don't have 4 or 5. First approach is to accept that bilateral dimension of relations will prevail. Each country will partner with the country of its choice on the basis of its national interest. And here, it's open to adopt whatever rules to your partners, to your partnership. You are free to adopt such or such rule or leave the rules that are in force actually. So that's one, bilateral approach or bilateral dimension. The second one is just to eliminate everything and say that countries are free to have some kind of open menu. You choose the configuration of multilateralism. It can be a mini multilateralism. It can be quasi-universal multilateralism. It can be regional, geographically regional. It can be regional based on values and principles. If you follow this approach, which favors regionalism, illustrated, for example, by the free trade zone in Africa, here you can borrow some principles, but you can also add some of your principles that are adapted to the situation of African countries. The last one, to me, seems to be more realistic. Multilateralism has been evolving. It's a work in progress. Okay. It has to be reformed. This goes without saying. Multilateralism today cannot exist as it existed in 1944 and even in the 80s. It has to change in order to meet the requirements of representativity, legitimacy, and efficiency. Okay. When I talk about efficiency, you cannot negotiate honestly between 193 countries. That's why you have these small groupings of G7, G8, G20. But here you have, yes, the groupings that are efficient, that are taking decisions. But who elected this 7? Who elected this 8? Who elected this? Yeah. They are lacking legitimacy, international legitimacy that only the United Nations and other universal or quasi-universal organizations can provide. There is a need to first to come back to the foundational principles of multilateralism, and secondly, I think to be pragmatic, to be realistic in dealing with the issue of sovereignty and solidarity between the members of the international community. It's not easy. It's not something that will come in 5 years or in 10 years, because I think that the first inclination of countries after COVID-19 and after this war is to concentrate on their domestic or sub-regional or regional scope of action. European Union will deal with European Unions. Americans with European Unions will deal with NATO. What is the future of NATO? What is the mandate of NATO? Can it be expanded? NATO and the South, a lot of things that are I think in action, and there will be a lot of thinking. Is the European Union going to pursue its defense and security strategy? It's going to develop its own foreign policy.
Versailles Declaration.
Will Brexit be followed by other exits? I mean, so many questions that come to mind. And the same questions, I think, are in Latin America, is about integration, not integration, about democracy, a lot of things. I did not develop anything about the questioning even of the representative democracy, because one of the features of the new multilateralism, it's not only limited to member states as stakeholders. Now you have multinationals that have an impact on international economy and international finance, and international politics. You have civil society that is coming through NGOs and some other forms as an actor of international relations. Look what is happening, for example, when it comes to COP27, 21 that we have, or 26. You have this dynamics of the civil society that I think will have more and more impacts on international organizations and on multilateralism.
And does United Nations Charter need a revision or a reform?
I hope that they will not try to review the Charter, because those who will try to reform the Charter of the United Nations today will not be as idealistic and as generous as those who formulated the Charter of the United Nations. Remember, the first sentence is "we the people." It's not "we the states." Mm-hmm. We have not done anything in terms of providing the people, and especially the people in the global south, about their basic needs and about their concerns. And yes, the Charter could be amended, of course, if you want to change, if you want to expand the Security Council, if you want maybe to reform the veto power, if you want, for example, to say, like this proposal that is in the air by France and Mexico and supported by so many states, that yes, you have the veto, but you cannot, you have to refrain from using the veto power in situations of a gross violation of human rights, etc., etc. But the question is, who is going to determine that it is a gross violation of human rights? It's the Security Council, and it's the P5. And if you have one of the P5 that will not determine a situation as such, then paralysis will be again back to the dynamic of the Security Council action or the United Nations action in general.
All right. Professor Rouishki, it was a pleasure to have you today. Thank you very much for your precious contribution, and hope to see you again as soon as possible.
Inshallah.